For centuries, a sacred resurrection passage existed beyond the awareness of most of the Christian world, not because it was deliberately concealed, but because it lived quietly within a different stream of history. Written in Gez, the ancient liturgical language of the Ethiopian Church, it remained preserved in monasteries carved into mountains and guarded by generations of monks who understood Scripture not as an object to be debated, but as a living current to be practiced. While Western Christianity moved through councils, creeds, empires, schisms, and reforms, this text sat undisturbed, read by candlelight, transmitted hand to hand, voice to voice. Only in recent years has it been translated and examined more broadly, and what it reveals is not a sensational challenge to Christianity, but something far more unsettling, a version of the resurrection that was never meant to end at the empty tomb. It does not ask for belief. It asks for transformation. It suggests that resurrection was never only an event to be proven, but a state of being to be entered. In this newly translated material, the resurrection unfolds slowly and deliberately. Jesus does not vanish quickly into heaven, leaving behind a message to be interpreted later by institutions. Instead, he remains for 40 days, teaching his followers how perception itself must change. The emphasis is not on convincing the skeptical or establishing authority, but on reshaping the inner life. Fear is described as a veil that distorts reality, while wonder opens the soul to truth. The sacred is not located in distant heavens or future judgments, but in how one learns to see, breathe, listen, and remain present. Resurrection in this telling is not merely the reversal of death. It is the awakening of a different mode of consciousness, one in which life is no longer experienced through anxiety, domination, or rigid law, but through intimacy with the divine woven into daily existence. This understanding of resurrection cannot be separated from Ethiopia's unique historical path. Long before Christianity became the religion of empire, Ethiopia embraced it as a national faith in the early 4th century, under King Ezana of Aksum. This occurred decades before Rome formally adopted Christianity and centuries before it became culturally dominant in Europe. Ethiopia's conversion was not enforced by imperial decree, nor shaped by the political needs of a collapsing empire. It emerged organically through local communities, monastic devotion, and missionary figures such as Frumentius, who's remembered in Ethiopian tradition as Abba Salama, the Father of Peace. Because the Ethiopian Church developed outside Roman and Byzantine power structures, it was free to shape its theology around lived spiritual experience rather than institutional uniformity. Its questions were different, and therefore its answers were different as well. While Rome increasingly asked how belief could be standardized and controlled, Ethiopia asked how the sacred could be encountered directly. This distinction shaped everything that followed. Ethiopian Christianity developed its own liturgical calendar, its own musical and poetic forms, and its own theological language rooted in Gez. It cultivated fasting disciplines, all-night vigils, embodied prayer, and a deep reverence for creation as a participant in spiritual life. The church was not primarily a seat of authority, but a rhythm of living. Mountains, rivers, sunlight, and silence were understood as collaborators in devotion. This was not abstraction or metaphor. It was a way of inhabiting the world. The depth and maturity of this tradition are made visible in Ethiopia's material culture, particularly in its manuscripts. Hidden in the highlands are some of the oldest surviving Christian books in existence, most famously the Grima Gospels. Radiocarbon dating places these illuminated manuscripts between the late 4th and 6th centuries, making them older than many of Europe's earliest biblical texts. These were not hastily produced or crudely preserved. They are works of extraordinary artistry, written on carefully prepared animal skin, bound by hand, and illustrated with vivid colors made from natural pigments. Each page reflects a devotional worldview in which writing, drawing, and prayer were inseparable acts. While much of Europe was struggling through political fragmentation after the fall of Rome, Ethiopian scribes were producing complete gospel books with theological coherence and aesthetic vision. These manuscripts challenge the assumption that Christianity flowed outward from Europe into the rest of the world. Instead, They reveal a parallel and independent Christian civilization flourishing in Africa. Ethiopia was not waiting for approval from Rome. It was cultivating its own saints, its own sacred geography, and its own understanding of the gospel. The Garima Gospels are not simply ancient books. They are evidence of a deeply rooted Christian identity that existed long before Western Europe emerged as a cultural center of Christianity. They also hint at something else, that Ethiopia may have preserved theological streams that were later narrowed or abandoned elsewhere. This becomes even clearer when examining Ethiopia's biblical canon. When Christian leaders in the West were shaping the contents of Scripture in the 4th and 5th centuries, many texts were excluded for being too mystical, too complex, or too difficult to regulate. Ethiopia chose a different path. Its Bible retained entire books that vanished from Western canons, including 1 Enoch and Jubilees. These were not fringe writings. They were influential texts within Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity, shaping ideas about angels, divine justice, sacred time, and resurrection. Centuries later, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed their antiquity. Fragments found near Qumran matched Ethiopia's full versions with striking consistency. Ethiopia had not added to these traditions. It had protected them. These books emphasize imagination, vision, and transformation rather than legalism alone. They describe a cosmos alive with meaning, where human beings are invited to participate in divine reality through disciplined perception and devotion. For Western authorities concerned with doctrinal clarity and institutional stability, such texts pose challenges. They encourage direct encounter rather than mediated authority. Ethiopia, however, embraced them as essential. They were not threats to faith. They were pathways into it. Among the most profound of these preserved works is the Mashafa Kedan, often translated as the Book of the Covenant. Passed quietly from monk to monk, it remained largely unknown outside Ethiopia for centuries. Its recently translated sections present teachings attributed to Jesus during the 40 days after the resurrection. These teachings do not resemble public sermons or legal instructions. They are intimate, contemplative, and often enigmatic. Jesus speaks of silence as sacred architecture, of prayer as a geometry that aligns the soul, and of perception as the true path to knowledge. Proof is gently dismissed. Signs are replaced by stillness. The resurrection becomes a journey rather than a conclusion, a process by which the human being learns to see without fear and to dwell in presence. In this vision, resurrection is not simply about defeating death. It is about transforming how life is lived. The body becomes a vessel of light. Grief becomes understanding. A lifelong movement toward clarity and compassion. These teachings echo earlier Jewish mysticism and the spirituality of the desert, where silence, fasting, and attentiveness were understood as technologies of transformation. It is not difficult to see why such material did not align easily with the theological structures that emerged after the Council of Nicaea. A faith oriented toward inner awakening resists rigid control. What emerges then are not two opposing Christianities, but two distinct emphases flowing from the same source. Rome asked how belief could unify an empire. Ethiopia asked how the sacred could be encountered directly. One path produced creeds, councils, and centralized authority. The other produced monasteries, chants, embodied rituals, and visionary theology. Neither path negates the other, but the imbalance of history meant that one became dominant while the other was largely forgotten outside its homeland. Today, these forgotten voices feel unexpectedly timely. Across much of the modern world, people are stepping away from organized religion not because they reject the sacred, but because they hunger for depth, authenticity, and lived meaning. They are weary of formulas and abstract doctrines disconnected from experience. The Ethiopian tradition speaks directly to this longing. Its texts do not begin by asking what one believes. They begin by asking how one sees. They offer practices rather than slogans, transformation rather than control. Silence, fasting, sacred breath, and disciplined attention are not framed as obligations, but as invitations into clarity. This reframing of resurrection carries profound implications. It expands Christianity's story beyond a narrow geographic and cultural lens and restores Africa to its rightful place at the foundation of Christian history. It reveals the biblical canon not as a fixed, universal artifact, but as a collection shaped by context, power, and choice. And it shifts the center of spiritual life away from mere agreement toward awakening. To know Christ in this vision is not to memorize words, but to become an echo of his way of seeing. Resurrection is no longer something that happened once, and is now defended. It is something that continues quietly within lives willing to be reshaped.